I'm going to stop sharing. Shafaat, take over. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Lindsey, for introducing our session today, and thanks all who could join us today here. So the work that I'm going to present here today is kind of a half-cooked dish, and that's the purpose that I want you guys to come and taste it and let me know how's it going and give me suggestions to improve, right? So, but it's also kind of my PhD journey so far. And I must say that I'm still an early stage doctoral student here, so there's a long way to go, but this is what I'm interested in, and I think this is the right time to seek suggestions. Before continuing, I must mention one thing, that the work that I'm presenting here, it's been, I got a chance to have a team of 6 members back in Pakistan who worked on all the data collection, so I'm privileged to present this work on their behalf as well. So here's a little bit of agenda for my work today. I'll present a little bit of context of where I stand in my doctoral journey and what my research is about. And then I'll talk about the research objectives of a project that I have been doing in past few months. And then I'll talk about their methodology, my findings so far, and then major agenda is to seek your feedback. So talking about the context, and as I told you, it's also about my journey in my PhD so far. When I came here from Pakistan, I knew one thing for sure, that I wanted to study Pakistani cities. So my first work started with studying the planning history in Pakistan in order to understand the ways in which Pakistan has been coping with the highest rate of urbanization in the South Asia, and how our cities have been planned and reconfigured in many ways. So that was the very first kind of literature-based study that I did. And I realized that the history of Pakistani planning is in its roots of the colonial era. And because most of the earliest planning institutions in the country developed in the colonial times, the subsequent changes of the profession were also done on that same core which was set in the colonial era, which was certainly of the modernist ideology of taking a state perspective to planning, with almost little or no agency to non-state actors. So in a way, when it comes to urban planning in Pakistan, there is always a conflict between state trying to enforce its own legitimacy versus a multitude of actors trying their own agency. But yeah, that's one body of literature which was useful for me to get into my PhD. And then on the right side of the picture here, you should be able to see it's a city of Lahore, which happens to be second largest city, but the fastest growing city in the country. You should be able to see the dark brown color is the extent of the city in year 2000. And the red and the yellow parts are the growth of the city in last 20 years. The city size has almost doubled in last 20 years. And also on the map, you should be able to see that most of these new expanding areas have blue dots, which I pointed on the map. These blue dots are some kind of industrial clusters or economic clusters. So most of the expanding parts of the city are experiencing these clusters. All of them have different characteristics, but my point of concern was that our cities are expanding in Pakistan, and in these expanding areas, we are experiencing these new economic hubs being generated. So I wanted to study those economic clusters in order to understand how they were being developed, what was the role that state was playing, but more than that, I wanted to understand those areas and who were the stakeholders which were developing those areas in the first place. So I started with the very first cluster, which I marked here on the right, the northeast side of the city. which is called Daroghawala. It's a industrial cluster, again, on the periphery, urban fringe of Lahore, and it also developed maybe in last 2 to 3 decades. So because it was an economic cluster, I started reading literature on economic clusters, and I studied about, the earliest literatures which kind of explain how economic clusters developed. And I ended up studying Porter's diamond model and Krugman's core periphery model, which kind of explained how these, like the whole theory of how clusters exist. But then also the co-location of industries were explained by the Marshallian externalities. But by that time, it was not coming to the city. Like, these clusters could exist anywhere. But then I saw that Jane Jacobs talked about how these industrial clusters, when they co-located in a city, they got advantage of being located in a city. And that's what she called the diversification, the benefits of diversification. So while Marshallian externalities were focused on the specialization, hers were on the diversification that you get by co-locating in a city. So in a way, the literature on the economic clusters was able to give me some perspective to get into these kind of areas. But then there was one major gap that I always felt, is that this literature on economic clusters was not really explaining the typology of the economic configuration or the spatial configuration of economy in Pakistani cities. Reason being is that according to a study in 2015 by the Urban Unit in Lahore, only 3.5% industries in Pakistan are located within planned industrial estates. So the rest, 96.5%, are outside any planned state, which are areas like these. And those areas are developed in alongside the residential areas and other uses. So there is no zoning, no difference between any type of land use and everything. It just happens to be there, right? So in order to understand that kind of economy, I had to start reading literature on bazaar. So bazaar, the earliest accounts of bazaar come from the anthropologists, of whom Clifford Geertz seems to be the most iconic person who wrote on bazaar, and who has been taken as the one person who explained it for the first time. But then persons like Edward Said kind of explain how areas like bazaar have been explained by the kind of Western academia in a way of looking at the non-Western world, which he says Orientalism in his book. But the point of his writing is that there is always a perception of studying the non-Western world as exotic places out there, right? But it has only been recently that scholars like Fanslow, Hattie, and Hoodley, and others have started talking about bazaar as an alternative mode of economic model, because bazaar is where multiplicity of commodities exist, and these commodities are of multiple types. So there is not a single specialized type of commodities being produced, but rather what locally is called from grade A to grade C type of commodities are being produced for all kind of consumers. So this was kind of a literature which made me think about these places, and this is where I stand right now. But one major challenge for my work was that the type of areas that I wanted to study, there was almost little to no data available for these kind of areas. So I was kind of scared to take this as a research project, because I knew that I couldn't collect all that data by myself. But this is where I kind of got lucky. I developed a team with some other researchers from Pakistan, and we reached out to Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, which happens to be country's top economic research institute. And we pitched our idea that we want to study one of these clusters to kind of understand how they emerged as an industrial cluster in the first place. What factors cause the enterprises in this area to grow? And what are the economic linkages of this area on different spatial scales? So with these 3 research objectives, we reached out to PIDE, and they were convinced to grant us a fund for 6 months, and we are already 4 months down the road, still 2 months to go. That's why I said this is still a half-cooked project, but we were able to hire a big team, like 6 members, 7 including me, and we were working on this project. So we were able to collect nice breadth of the primary data in order to kind of dive into one of these projects. Here's a little bit of methodology. I don't go really in detail here, but I'll just mention that to understand how the Rogawala emerged as an industry cluster, we used a ground theory. Like we wanted to develop something from by going into the field, and which was of course through the primary interviews. But then we also did some land use surveys, and we used remote sensing tools as well as secondary data to triangulate what we were finding in the field in order to make more sense out of it. Secondly, to establish the growth function of the enterprises, we used OLS regression. We plan to do 180 primary interviews, which are still in progress, but I present results from whatever interviews have been done so far. And then in order to estimate the economic linkages at different spatial scales, we kind of developed a transaction table in a customized way, because we couldn't develop the whole sum of that because of lack of data. But the table that we are able to develop from the data is kind of a starting point for us, which I'll be presenting later. So just to give you an idea that this is the Rogawala, which is the case that we selected. And just to give you a context, the area is around 8 square kilometers. For a context, you can think of it as an area equal to that of downtown Chicago. So, just think of it as a simple figure ground map, but only showing the industrial uses or industry related uses. But you can see that this is not only that, it is being developed alongside other uses, which include residences, schools, health services, graveyards, and everything. So it's kind of just an expanding part of the city with industrial uses happening alongside them. And if we look at the same area through the land use cover map, we kind of see that this area was really developed between last 2 to 3 decades. So this kind of gave us an idea that what happened on the bigger scale, that this kind of industrial activity emerged in the country. And in order to link that to the bigger level dynamics, we kind of correlated it with some data from the national level of manufacturing. So right here, you'll be seeing many lines, but I request you to focus on the blue and yellow for now. So the yellow line shows Darogawala's production in, because again, we had to use a proxy to estimate production, and we used the tons of metal being processed in industries in order to as a proxy for the production in the Rogawala. And on the blue line is a combination of the large scale manufacturing index, which is published by the Bureau of Statistics in Pakistan. And it's a combination of the iron and steel production in the country and automobile construction in the country. We used it with many other data sets, but this is where seemed to make most sense, which is that production in the Rogawala kinda increased with increasing trend of the production in the country in iron and steel sector. But after 2017, that sector dropped and then came back, but the Rogawala hasn't really come back. We don't know yet why, but this is where we are so far. So there seems to be a correlation over there, but we still know that much only. So we'll be working further on that. So we went ahead and we did some land use surveys in the area, and we noted that, of course, there were different types of industries, different types of uses happening there, but we realized that majorly this was a metal manufacturing industrial cluster. On the left side, you should be able to see there is a table which shows that there were total 661 primary metal industries in the area. And by primary metal industries, we meant that those type of enterprises which were really manufacturing metal-related products. And on the right side, you should be able to see the kind of metal products that they were producing. And we linked it with the standard industrial classification system so that if this study is published later at a later stage, audience from around the world is able to link it with their own classification. But yeah, then next you should be able to see there is ancillary metal industry, which doesn't really manufacture metal products, but it kind of process it by cutting it or shaping it or painting, electroplating, fabricating, like all these different kind of processes happening there. So these ancillary metal industries are almost equal in number to the primary metal industries, but they actually have their business because of the primary metal industries. And then we saw that there is industry supporting commerce developed in the area because most of these primary metal industries do not have their own store for the availability of raw materials and everything. So they avoid that storage capacity cost by taking benefit of this industry supporting commerce in the area. But the stores that support this industry are so specific to the industrial uses that they kind of become a part of the industrial activity. So in a way, we realized that the Roghawala, the people in the Roghawala kind of developed an ecosystem of industries or an industrial ecosystem wherein primary industry, secondary industry, and the industry relating commerce is all working together within one enclave. As opposed to, and mind you, I must mention that along the same time period, the government was launching a lot of industrial estates, but people did not locate there, but they located here. And maybe one of the reasons or one of the explanations could be that because the areas or the demarcations in the planned industrial estates did not allow for this kind of industrial ecology to develop. Then we, because we were doing our interviews, we kind of tried to understand what kind of products are being manufactured in the area. I wouldn't really go into discussing all of them, but these were majorly automobile as well as metal related iron and steel related works happening there. And then there were different type of industrial processes happening in the area, and they were using all these different kind of metals for their processes. So in our for our first research objective, where we wanted to understand how the Roghawala developed as an industrial cluster, so far this is what we have found. We found that the Roghawala has developed in last 3 to 4 decades on the urban fringe of rapidly expanding city Lahore. This area had access to major transport corridors. Land was cheap and the government regulation was minimum. Now this is a prime point because the literature on the economic activity in South Asia continues to assert that there is too much of government regulation. It's a dilemma. Like on one side, you could say that the government doesn't really have that much of capacity to regulate, but at the same time, there's always literature saying that it's a dilemma that there's a lot of government regulation. But this area, there was minimum government regulation. So people could just take a piece of land and open their industry, and that's it. And that's why they had access to this area for the development of an industrial activity. And then, of course, country was experiencing increased demand and production in iron, steel, and automobile industry. And this is where these enterprises open to meet this demand. And finally, we understand that the Roghawala became an industrial cluster because it developed an ecosystem of industrial activity, which we find as the key point here for the development of the Roghawala. Moving forward for our second research objectives, where we were supposed to develop a growth function. So we wanted to understand what factors affect the growth of these enterprises in this area. We've calculated data on different variables. Again, description is here. In the interest of time, I wouldn't go into detail, but in a way, we are now able to understand overall structure of the enterprises in the Roghawala. What's their usual annual change ratio? What is their age of business? what's usual business volume, what is usual business capital, what's the credit availability, what's the current number of employees, and what are their research expenditures. And of course, all of these variables were coming from different studies in the literature, which suggested that these kind of variables could affect the growth rate function. And then, of course, we were also asking them about the type of manufacturing processes that they were using and the clientage that they had and so forth. So far from our OLS estimation, our model 4 here seems to work fine, which kind of explains so far that from literature, of course, we found 4 major variables which were supposed to affect the growth rate function. First was that availability of credit was supposed to help them grow, but this did not happen to be the case in our study. And then the percentage of research expenditure was also supposed to help them grow, but that didn't. Our explanation is that maybe it was because it was because of our data. There was not a lot of variance in our independent variable, which is why a relationship could not exist. And maybe when we go further and we have more data, maybe it would change. But we ended up finding 2 relationships here. First, that enterprises that adopt semi-digital or digital manufacturing process, they grow faster than those who are using conventional processes. And secondly, that the businesses that had a permanent clientage, which is that having permanent vendors to continue business with them over time, they tend to grow because of the ability to take risks and invest to upgrade their system. And finally, because we wanted to know the economic linkages that the Roghawala industry cluster had at different spatial scales, we kind of tried to develop a transactions table where this is a smaller box which kind of shows the transactions happening within the Roghawala among the 3 type of activities that we noted. And then you should be able to see how the Roghawala has linkages on different spatial scales. And what we found so far is that the Roghawala mostly purchases most of the stuff from Lahore, which happens to be the metropolitan city where this cluster is located, but it happens to have a really large export on global scale. So in a way, we found that this area, which usually are, government would like to maybe say as an irregular or an unplanned area or whatever, for a country that has economic challenges, this area still has an economic importance. But yeah, that's that, because this is where we are. We wanted to kind of get these initial figures for the area, and we got some of this from this study. And this is where I stand with my PhD. And then from here, I'll take further inputs and suggestions. So your feedback is important. I think it's time to open the floor for questions. So yeah. All right, so the reason why we selected this area is a combination of manufacturers in which convenience was, of course, a big thing, because to study these kind of clusters, you need to have at least an approach, because people wouldn't be comfortable answering you about their business, about their capital and everything. So we were able to access, so PIDE was a big sport, our funder, and through them, we were able to approach the association of the industrial owners in the area. And we talked to them before starting our project, and they kind of agreed that, okay, you can come, and they looked at our survey, and when they were convinced that, yeah, you can go ahead, that's when we ended up selecting this area. But in my future work, I plan to add few more areas, because in a way I want to understand and theorize how these kind of economic activities are spatially configured in Pakistan. So only one case wouldn't really work a lot. So I've got some initial insights through this case, and then I'll take some other cases to kind of try to generalize it if that could, or if results could replicate. So yeah. Not in case of this cluster, but in case of other cities. So for example, in case of, there is a city called Sialkot. It happens to be a major sports industry, but then it's also a metal-based cluster. So it's like, it's an industrial city, right? And all type of industrial activity happening within one big cluster. So there is that kind of diversity. So yeah. Please. Sure. Yeah, that's so important, because I have been there. I was working with that organization which produced land use plan for Pakistan, right? For these kind of areas, on the map, it's just, we just mark that it's a built up area, because it's so difficult to go in there and really study it and then zone it out. And even if you zone it on the map, it's not really gonna work. People are not gonna move or anything. Yeah. So they just show it that it's a built up area, and that's that. Yeah. Yes. Right. Is there a yeah. Sure. Yeah. Can I request some? We want her time to be. Can I talk to you guys later? I'm sorry. I want your questions, but don't want to take her time. Thank you.
And I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slides. So my context is a little different than Shafaat's. I'm in my 4th year, and I recently, sorry, let me just take care of this really quickly. All right. I recently defended my dissertation proposal, and I am going to be presenting this next week at a conference, the Active Living Conference, which I'm also presenting some other research I've been doing that is also informed by this sort of pedestrian-oriented zoning. So I am actually very interested in my timing, so I'm going to go ahead and, or Andy, maybe you could time me. I'm trying to aim for about 12 minutes, but not over 15. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Lindsey. I'm a 4th year PhD candidate, and my background is in public health, and that's why there's a lot in this that has to do with that background. And I'm very interested in how we use urban planning and policy and zoning to help better facilitate health or positive health behaviors, but really interested in sort of asking better health for whom. And my research is really looking at this relationship between pedestrian-oriented zoning reforms and gentrification. Okay, so I just really want to first acknowledge my dissertation committee for all of their very valuable input and support that they've given me, but also that data collection for my research was supported by a CDC project that I've been working on for the past few years with Dr. Jamie Shariki. She's over in the School of Public Health at UIC. Very quickly, I'm going to review my research questions, and then the bulk of the presentation is really a review of the literature that I've done so far in preparation for my actual research design. And then I will sort of very quickly go through some of my planned research and my next steps as I move forward now that I've got the green light to go. But before I do that, I really want to make sure, sort of do some level setting and make sure we're all on the same page when I'm talking, like, what am I talking about when I say pedestrian-oriented zoning reforms? Zoning reforms as a term kind of gets thrown out quite a lot these days, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear about what I'm talking about. So these are generally zoning changes that are happening that are based on new urbanist principles, which emphasize walkable and mixed-use communities. Traditional land or traditional zoning has really focused more on the separation of uses, whereas these pedestrian-oriented zoning reforms are really focused more on compact urban form and more predictability. So on the right-hand side, this is like a very common feature of what's called a form-based code, which is essentially there's still regulation about different land uses that can be there, but the bulk of the code is actually much more focused on these different sort of urban features. So saying that when you're doing new development, you have to have like this 6 to 8 foot pedestrian zone. And this is what your building frontage has to look like. So there's a lot more emphasis on this building form versus land use. And within the context of my study and the one I've been working on with Dr. Shariki, these are the types of districts or zoning that we are counting under this sort of reform zoning category. We've actually kind of put transit-oriented development into its own category, but in a lot of our analyses, we combine them with all of these other districts as zoning reform. And I just also want to make a quick note. A lot of people also talk about transit-oriented development. That could just mean, you know, a development that goes around a transit station. But within the zoning code itself, there are transit-oriented development districts or transit-oriented districts. So that's sort of what I'm capturing there, not necessarily transit infrastructure itself. So my 3 big research questions that are guiding me, the first one being is like, what does the adoption and implementation of these reforms look like in practice? What is the relationship between the adoption of pedestrian-oriented zoning reforms and gentrification? And then within that question, I sort of broken out a few sub-questions. One sort of has to do with what's causing what. So I'm sort of curious, is zoning reform causing or potentially related to gentrification that happens later, or are changing neighborhoods and gentrification leading to changes in the zoning reform or changes in the zoning? And then also, these different strategies do look different within the zoning code. They share a lot of similar characteristics, but they can be quite different. So I'm also sort of looking and exploring how they compare to one another. And then lastly, I'm really interested in this idea of walkability because the goal of these, or so they say, is to really promote a more pedestrian-oriented environment. And so I'm sort of curious to see, is that walkability itself potentially mediating these relationships if they exist? Like, is walkability really the reason that neighborhoods are changing? So I'm planning on exploring that as well. All right, so let me start off by sort of talking about what I mean when I say gentrification, and put it out there that there is no defined definition for gentrification within research, within for anybody. It's people have quite different understandings of it. In some contexts, it's a very negative thing. In some contexts, it's a positive thing. But I've decided to use this urban displacement project definition. And there's 3 components of it that I really want to highlight here. One, that this is a process of neighborhood change that includes economic and demographic change. So I've highlighted those economic and demographic change. And then the other really important part of it is that it happens in historically disinvested neighborhoods. So this idea that for gentrification to happen, there had to be a period of disinvestment that sort of leaves it open for increased investment and change. And that has a lot to do with the theory around gentrification. This is, I just want to say, highly reductive, but the sort of 2 prevailing theories in gentrification literature is around this demand versus supply side. And so the demand side is really focused on what's considered consumption forces, with a focus on sort of motivations and economic choices of gentrifiers themselves. So Lay was a kind of a big author within this sphere, and they really talked about a new cultural class that was middle-class professionals who wanted to move into urban areas again and sort of defined by their politics and lifestyle. sort of a subgroup within that, or kind of a more emerging group that I have found sort of helpful in my research, is thinking about this sustainability class, which is again this progressive white middle class families that want to live in urban areas and have these like ecologically focused lifestyles. To be perfectly honest, I find myself sort of like fitting into that. I like to bike places. I don't like to drive. You know, I want to live close to public transit. So just kind of to put that into context. And then in terms of the production forces, these are really, this theory is really focused on economic conditions that create gentrified neighborhoods. And a lot of this theory has been really driven by neo-Marxist thinkers, including Harvey, and Neil Smith is also kind of a huge name within this theoretical framework, who really talks about these inherent inequities in capitalism that drive disinvestment in areas that kind of leave them primed for investment and profit. And I want to finish this slide by saying that I would say most people doing research on gentrification tend to, I think at this point in time, understand that this is not one or the other, but this is a complex process that is involving both sides of this, and that it's one also kind of goes into the other. You know, economic and consumption habits are driven by economic forces as well. So I'm not necessarily staking a claim on one side or the other, but actually thinking that these go hand in hand quite a bit. So I have sort of two different conceptual frameworks. I first started my research with this one, which was really thinking that you had this historical context of traditional zoning, automobile-oriented planning, and sort of race, class-driven land use policies that sort of really drove disinvestment in certain neighborhoods. And then you had this regulatory change, which helped kind of increase private investment and public investment. You have new housing development, you have new green infrastructure, new transportation options, which then leads to increased desirability and real estate values, then leading that's sort of like that left. What's your left? Is that your left? Yeah, that left side being sort of gentrification related. And so that's sort of one of my first questions, right? Is like, is this the relationship? The other potential framework is quite the opposite, which is that is the gentrification as an input actually affecting the policy change? So is this influx of sustainability class residents into a disinvested area in the city creating more political will for land use changes that help meet their lifestyle needs and consumption behavior? So I'm sort of, hopefully with my analysis, going to be sort of looking at both of these and testing whether maybe one makes more sense than the other. But what do we know about pedestrian-oriented zoning reforms? Quantitatively, very little. They've increased quite a lot in terms of adoption over the past 20 years, but only 2 studies that I've found actually are looking at like gentrification-related outcomes. And one was authored by the Form-Based Code Institute and Smart Growth America. Both organizations are very pro form-based code. So they have sort of some perhaps institutional bias towards sharing positive information. Their report was really more about like economic outcomes in places that have adopted these codes, but they also looked at sociodemographic changes. Okay, great. And they were essentially like, there's some change, but gentrification is not happening. Talon, also a researcher at U of C, who's been very pro new urbanism, looked at sort of this cross-sectional analysis of census tracts that have adopted form-based codes versus not. And both have essentially said gentrification is not a concern. I think there's a lot of room for methodological improvement. And so I'm hoping my research can help fill that. But there's also been quite a lot of research on transit-oriented development as like an infrastructure and gentrification. And so, but even that, like a recent systematic review has sort of said there's some evidence that this exists, but in terms of the variability of findings and methods used, we really can't draw any solid conclusions. And a lot of this, again, has to do with challenge in defining and operationalizing gentrification. But there is some evidence, right? And then another sort of corollary to what I'm looking at is this idea of gentrification as a result of green infrastructure. Again, sort of mixed quantitative evidence or that there's an association, and that like this green infrastructure is quite context specific in terms of its resulting gentrification. But I do really want to highlight that the qualitative research tells, I would say, a consistent story. And this is really just high level and doesn't represent the full breadth of like qualitative research that's been done on this. But a number of qualitative studies have more definitively said gentrification is happening as a result of form-based codes or new urbanist planning processes, and that displacement is happening. And I just want to tie this back to health. So why am I interested in gentrification as a health outcome? There's been quite a lot of new research in the past 10 years that's trying to untangle this. And I think, what's interesting is that there is this potential for physical improvements that could be health promoting, right? And that's sort of the idea behind pedestrian-oriented zoning. But if you can't stay and you don't feel welcome, then it's not for you, right? And that's sort of what really drives my interest in this. So in terms of my research approach, I'm going to be looking at cases where the zoning reforms have happened at a district or corridor level, which really kind of tracks with gentrification at a neighborhood process, because there are jurisdictions as a whole that have adopted these, and so I'm not really going to be concerning myself with that. I'm going to be looking from 1980 to 2020 and looking at cases where the reform was adopted after 2000, so that I have this full 20 years pre-post to sort of look at changes. And then be using like essentially GIS zoning data to match with census tracts, yada yada. And I have kind of multiple components of my research. I'm going to be doing a few case studies, sort of just understanding trends and characteristics of the cases versus controls. Then I'm going to be exploring the sort of a potential causal relationship, and then looking as this walkability as mediator. I want to zone in a little bit on the relationship between zoning reforms and gentrification. So to sort of understand the direction of the relationship, I'm going to be doing multi-level regression models that sort of flip around my independent variables and sort of look at, and this is based on some work that Ferenczak and Marshall did around bike infrastructure and neighborhood change. So I'm really kind of following some of that work. And then also in terms of testing a causal relationship, I'm going to be using a difference in difference estimation approach. But the classic DID approach really doesn't work here because these zoning changes are happening at different staggered times. Thanks in no part to my work, but into part of like a lot of great other work that's been going on. There's these new estimation models that are really getting at these like heterogeneous treatment effects and heterogeneous times that I'm going to be using to help me with this analysis. And I can't really get into that in terms of just how much time I have, but I'm very like lucky because all of this has happened like literally within the past 2 years that a lot of these new estimation strategies have come out. So that will also play a role. So in terms of summary, there have been very few quantitative studies that actually look at this relationship. So I'm really hoping that my study can fill an important gap. But based on qualitative and quantitative research that has been done, I think there's a good reason to think that gentrification could be happening and displacement could be happening. And so right now I'm actually starting the legwork. I'm identifying the zoning areas. I'm going to be matching that to census tracts, trying to gather all of my data right now and doing these analyses, and also sort of thinking about how I'm going to identify my case studies. So I'm developing a typology to look at that currently. All right, thank you so much, and I will take questions. So I got it around 12 minutes-ish?
No,
15? Oh, I got to put it down. That's okay. Because I'm part of a panel that is also talking about pedestrian-oriented zoning reforms, I'm hoping I can cut out that whole slide because 3 people will have already talked about that. So hopefully I can cut out a minute there. But yeah, any questions for me?
I have one. In the first slide, you showed transect, form-based, and smart growth. I thought we were very connected when, like, that distinction is necessary to research.
Yes and no. And form-based codes and transect-based coding and smart, what is it?
Growth.
No, smart growth, it can be a little bit different. There's another one that's like called the smart code, and it's essentially like a copyrighted form-based code that jurisdictions can adopt. Form-based codes and transects are very closely related. In the zoning code itself, sometimes they will mention both, sometimes they only mention one or the other. Within our sort of data collection process, we would have marked like it's form-based and transect-based, and here's all these like markers and information on those districts themselves. So there's not like, even in my research, there won't be a lot of like distinction between them. But more that this is a place of, like, this is a case, this has been treated by this type of pedestrian-oriented zoning. Does that help you? Yeah. Oh, and smart growth, isn't necessarily, a lot of smart growth districts you don't see that often. They're more like, smart growth is more of like a larger planning strategy, but you do actually see municipalities that adopt these smart growth districts that have this mixed use, concentration on infill development for a specific area of the city, but they don't tend to use like transect as much. From what I remember, I collected data on like 2,000 plus zoning codes, so it all kind of gets, mushed in my head.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Is the ratio of adoption of form-based codes, are they like significant compared to normal zoning codes? It's like a real trend that you can quantify.
Yeah, it's a real trend. Most municipalities still have very traditional zoning, and I want to pull something up to sort of get to that point. It's a figure I have in a different presentation, but I'm not going to waste my time doing that. But like, it's really skyrocketed. Even within our own data collection efforts, we've seen like twice since 2010, between 2010 and 2020, like twice as many jurisdictions have adopted form-based or some sort of pedestrian-oriented zoning reform. And form-based codes is probably the most popular sort of strategy within that. And so the sample that I'm using as of right now is like over 300 jurisdictions. So I still have to do some culling there, and that's sort of my next step, is to match it up to the actual zoning data. I'm not going to be looking at places that adopt like code reform for future development, because I don't have anything to look back at in terms of neighborhood change. So some municipalities will be like, for new suburban development, you need to use a traditional neighborhood development approach. I'm not going to be able to really include that in my analysis, but I'm still, I think I'll still have several hundred jurisdictions to work from. And this is like across the country database data set that I'm going to be looking at. Yeah. Dean, did you have a question?
Oh, I'm trying to kind of articulate this, so it's going to come out kind of funny, but was that you said that EPA walkability index is one of the things. Are there any aspects of that index that don't get captured in the zoning reform? Like, I'm thinking of how public works, like sidewalk condition, like that kind of thing. Like, how do you connect those?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I unfortunately couldn't like get into it too much in this presentation, but so there's a few components of that I want to look at. So as part of this research project that I've been doing with Jamie, everyone walk around.
Oh, where the motion?
Oh yeah, they're up there actually. Sorry, the lights have gone on us in here. So the goal of her research is really looking at these zoning changes and how they relate to physical activity. Right? She's a public health researcher. Yeah. So that's what we're focused on. So when we collected all this data, we were actually reading through the zoning code to assess whether there were like these components to it that facilitate physical activity. So do they address sidewalks? Are sidewalks even addressed? Are crosswalks addressed? Are bike trails or just like pedestrian trails addressed? So I have all this data about whether these things are being addressed in the zoning code. So part of my sort of walkability analysis is actually just going to say, how does the EPA walkability index compare to what's actually being said in the zoning code? Because the walkability index only, it includes whether the land use typology, so whether it's mixed use,
Right.
transit accessibility, I'm trying to remember all the components of it. Like, because it's a national database, it can only use like essentially what's available nationally. And so you don't necessarily get pedestrian conditions as part of that. And I think that unfortunately is just, that data just doesn't exist.
Sure.
As someone who used to do walkability audits, I understand how incredibly difficult that data is to collect and how often it changes. So that's sort of the first step, is to be comparing it to what we actually see in the zoning code, seeing if there's like high correlation with that. But ultimately, I kind of just want to see what these, kind of using our zoning data separately from the walkability index, seeing if it plays as mediating factor in terms of this relationship. That's sort of the main interest of mine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll hopefully get at that a little bit.
Yeah, it was just like when you select your cases, like, you know, should those communities have maybe a sidewalk utility, or what are the rules for who is, if you're looking at sidewalks, maintaining them? Like, is it the homeowner, is it the city?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are not going to have that level of data, but that's what's sort of interesting about these zoning reforms, is that they at least kind of require actual sidewalks to be there. In most zoning, traditional zoning, it doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't really require any zoning or any pedestrian facilities whatsoever. So yeah.
Great.
I have a kind of yes or no question, because I don't really understand all the gentrification in US. So my question is, whether do you think that all pedestrian-oriented zonings are gentrification, or there are also cases where they did adopt this zoning, but they didn't have to do gentrification?
I'm not sure if I completely understand. I think there's an assumption there that they want gentrification to happen. And maybe that is the case. I don't think it's happening in all cases. And I highly doubt that most people or planners that work on these say that they want to induce gentrification. In the few case studies that I've read, when planners are seeing that gentrification and displacement are happening, it tends to be quite responsive to try to stop it or try to mitigate it in some way. So like an earlier version of my interest in this was also to say, to look at whether there are policy practices that are also moderating this relationship, is inclusionary zoning, which sort of mandates affordable housing, is that affecting this relationship at all? If municipalities have these things in place, is this stopping gentrification or slowing it down or whatever? But I've decided to be more focused based on feedback I've gotten that I need to hone in a little bit. So that's a big interest of mine, actually, is sort of how do we stop displacement if it's happening, or how do we sort of make these spaces inclusive and help them be health promoting for everybody. But hopefully I'll sort of get at some of that when I do the case studies, what were their intentions of when they adopted these policies. Anything else? Well, we're right at 1, so perfect timing, everybody. Thank you, everyone online, for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Shafaat or myself. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,